what is different about your new book here compared to your previous one, the Sisters of the Nazareth Covenant?
My books on Nazareth up to this point had been academic works. I wrote one in 2020, or one was published in 2020, and another in 2021. The first on the Roman and Byzantine period in Nazareth and its hinterland, and the second on the Sisters of Nazareth convent, which is a multi-period site. The current book is different to those in the sense that it's aimed at a much wider audience. You don't need to be a professional archaeologist or historical specialist to understand it or to appreciate the technicalities of it. And the new book also contains a much tighter focus on the first century, particularly the early first century, when Jesus is said by the Gospels to have lived in Nazareth, and it's the period that most people associate with the history and archaeology of Nazareth because of that.
When you look at Nazareth in the first century CE, how much of it did it change, like compared to what it was before 70 AD to after 70 AD?
Well, we have a pretty clear picture now of first century Nazareth, and the biggest change after the first revolt was the influx of a wealthy part of the population who created monumental tombs, rock-cut tombs, all around the central area of Nazareth. And they are the tombs that you see plotted on maps of so-called biblical Nazareth. And many people have, over the years, thought they were good evidence for the Nazareth that Jesus lived in, and they may well be much later than that. They may well be wholly of the mid to late first century and onwards. Some of them are first century. We know that pretty much from their form and from the objects within them, but none of them can be confidently dated to the period that the Gospels describe as the period of Jesus's life in Nazareth. So that influx of that wealthy population, probably refugees from Judea, from the south, and probably including the priestly family, which epigraphic evidence suggests that came to Nazareth at that period. These people will have fundamentally transformed the nature of the Nazareth community, which up until then shows no special signs of wealth or architectural embellishment. And these tombs are therefore evidence of quite a different sort of population within Nazareth to that of the early first century.
Do you think that the Gospels portrays an accurate account of what Nazareth was supposed to look like, or do you think the Gospels are inaccurate on this?
The Gospels don't really tell us much about what Nazareth was meant to look like. They say that there was a synagogue, but they don't say that it was a building. A synagogue at this period could mean an assembly of people in the open air, in another type of building entirely than a purpose-built synagogue. Either of those, or it could of course have been a purpose-built synagogue. We just don't know what the Gospels are referring to by there being a synagogue in Nazareth. So that's really the one specific we're given in the Gospels account of what even could be a structure in Nazareth. I mean, obviously, it's presented as a place where people live, so one assumes that the Gospels are implying that there are houses in Nazareth, but they don't actually say anything about them, and they certainly don't say anything about any other buildings or built structures of any kind. What they say, apart from that, is that Nazareth, in Luke's Gospel, I think it is, they say that Nazareth was built on a hill, but what exactly that means is really open to question. Does it mean on a hillside? Does it mean on a hilltop? Does it mean both? As it happens, early first century evidence in Nazareth comes from hill slopes. It comes from a hilltop, and it probably was found down in the valleys as well, valley beneath these as well. What that tells us really is nothing of any significance. Therefore, I mean, what the biblical text tells us about the layout or the character of Nazareth. So really, apart from those details, and that there was somewhere that someone might be thrown off for offending the community, the people in the synagogue tried to throw Jesus off a slope or down a slope, which is somewhere near or within the settlement of Nazareth. These things just tell us nothing really about Nazareth as a place. But archaeology now tells us lots about first century Nazareth as a place. So if we want to learn about the place in which Jesus grew up and spent most of his life, bear in mind his ministry was only a small part of his adult life. If we want to learn about that context of most of Jesus's life, then we have to turn to archaeology. And archaeology now tells us quite a lot about it. And
Could you repeat what you said for the last 20 seconds because you broke up? You said archaeology tells us quite a lot.
Archaeology now tells us, archaeology now tells us quite a lot about the settlement of Nazareth at the time when Jesus lived there. And it can certainly shed a vast amount more light on the context of his childhood and his adult life until his ministry than any written source. So in terms of using archaeology to understand the context of Jesus's life, the Archaeology of Nazareth is really a marvelous source. And that's what this book is partly about. It's partly about how much archaeology can tell us about the context, the immediate context of Jesus in the Galilee.
You mentioned that in the book that Nazareth was used as a place to hide after 70 AD when Galilee was taken over by the Romans. Could you expand on that?
Well, during the first revolt, the first Jewish revolt, one typical piece of archaeology that we find is a series of hiding places, usually pre-existing underground spaces that have been modified, sometimes linked by burrow-like tunnels in the rock. And these have been modified in this way in order for people to hide from the Roman authorities, particularly, of course, the Roman army, in the context of the Jewish revolt. So in Galilee, we're talking 68, 69 for military action involving the Jewish revolt. So when we find, as we do, in the centre of modern Nazareth, at the Church of the Annunciation site, and at the International Marian Centre site, evidence of these hiding places, we have evidence here of not necessarily participation in the first revolt, but a consciousness of the need to protect oneself from the Roman authorities in the context of the first revolt. Now, these are very archaeologically interesting in their own regard, but certainly they're very useful archaeologically because they do, in Nazareth as elsewhere, reuse earlier agricultural and storage facilities, ones that were dug underground into the rock, which is limestone in Nazareth. It's very easily worked. Obviously, if a pre-existing agricultural pit or installation under the ground has been reused in 68, 69 as a refuge place, such as these that I'm talking about, that means that agricultural installation or pit has been in existence in 68, 69, and probably has been in existence prior to that. And thus we have what archaeologists call a terminus ante quem, a date before which, for many dug features in the Church of the Annunciation site and some elsewhere in central Nazareth. So that enables us to pin down the date of some of the first century archaeology of Nazareth much more precisely than we would be able to otherwise.
Is there any archaeological evidence that there was a synagogue at Nazareth?
Absolutely none. There's a building which is widely known as the Synagogue Church. It sounds strange to say Synagogue Church, but that's what it's called. And that was a medieval and modern building. And at some point in its history, it became used as a Christian church. There is a modern legend, really, that it stands on the site of the synagogue mentioned in the Gospels. There is absolutely no archaeological evidence that it does. It might do, for all we know, but there's no archaeological evidence that it does, and none for any other synagogue in Nazareth. So the first time we can be really confident that there was a synagogue in Nazareth is in the late antique period, in the period of the transition between the Roman Empire and what comes after it. And then we have textual references to a synagogue in Nazareth. And one presumes this is a Jewish synagogue being referred to in the context of a Christian pilgrimage site. So it's quite interesting that not only was there a Jewish community still in Nazareth when it was a Christian pilgrimage site in the early Byzantine period, but that Jewish community seems to have had its own synagogue. So in among all the buildings of the Christian pilgrimage site, there was a Jewish synagogue.
So would it be fair to say that this could be evidence of the Gospels being mistaken about saying that there's something there at Nazareth that is not there?
It's not evidence that there was not a synagogue because of two things. First of all, most of central Nazareth has never been excavated and nothing is known of its archaeology. There could be 2 or 3 synagogues there for all we know because of that. So one cannot ever argue from negative evidence of man-made or purpose-built, constructed, whatever you want to call them, features in the archaeology of Nazareth. Just because something has not been found, it by no means, in the archaeology of Nazareth anyway, that it wasn't there. So in that sense, there could be a synagogue yet unfound. But there's another dimension to the Gospel's reference to a synagogue that makes it impossible to refute the reference to a synagogue at all. Because in an early first century context, a synagogue might be a building, but it really only refers to an assembly of people. They could be assembling in the open air. They need not be doing so in a building. If they were doing so in a building, they could have been doing so in a building built for and generally used for other purposes. So even if we had a total excavation of the entirety of first century Nazareth, and there wasn't a synagogue there, in the sense of a building, we couldn't really say that the Gospel's reference to a synagogue was inaccurate. So just as in every aspect of the archaeology of Nazareth, as it's known, the evidence doesn't refute or cast doubt upon even any of the Gospel's account. But as I've said, that's hardly surprising in a way, because the Gospels tell us very little about Nazareth as a place.
I'd like to ask about figure 3.3 in the book. You mentioned the light well in a large cave probably formed out of the opening of an early Roman period cistern.
Yeah. The large cave at the Sisters of Nazareth site was used in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and later centuries as a cave church, an artificial cave constructed to be a Christian church. How they did this was to burrow inwards from the side of a pre-existing tomb chamber, which had been dug in the Roman period, further into the hillside, and connect that pre-existing tomb chamber with an also pre-existing Roman period storage pit or silo, which these things have distinctive pear-shaped profiles. And we can see the remains of that profile in the apsidal end, the end where there would have been the Byzantine altar of the 4th century and later cave church. So essentially, you have two earlier Roman period features, a tomb and a silo or storage pit, linked in the 4th century by the construction of the cave church and incorporated in it. Now, what they did with the silo, which, as I said, had a pear-shaped profile and an open top, approximately circular open top, what they did with that was they made that part of the apse, the curved end where the altar goes, of the cave church. And so they could use the aperture, the opening of the silo, as a light well, as an opening which lets light into a subterranean space in the apsed end of the cave church. Why they would want to do this is because in late Roman and Byzantine church design, it was desirable to have natural light illuminating the altar. We have a lot of evidence of this, for example, in Byzantine churches. So this enabled them to have natural light illuminating the altar of the underground cave church. So that worked out well for them, but also, of course, was very economical in terms of construction. So they had to carve away less of the natural rock to create their cave church.
Is there any evidence that maybe Jesus's followers or any mass Jewish gatherings took place at Nazareth at all?
Well, we don't know how Nazareth was used, if at all, by the very earliest Christians. There is no evidence for that. There's nothing in the Gospels which suggests that the earliest Christians gathered at Nazareth, and there's nothing in the archaeology that would suggest Christian gatherings before the 4th century. Whether Nazareth was visited by Christian pilgrims or individual Christians for religious reasons before the 4th century is a very debatable question. It might have been, it might not have been. But in terms of gatherings, let's say, of 20 or more people, we've no evidence until, that is, the first churches are built in the 4th century, when we have evidence of a church at the Sisters of Nazareth site, the cave church, which I've been speaking about just now, and of a built church at the Church of the Annunciation site. That 4th century church at the Church of the Annunciation site was eventually disused, and its site partly covered by some sort of paved surface. And that paved surface was outside the cave of the Annunciation, the cave that Christians identified from at least the late Roman period, possibly earlier, with the Annunciation. And so on that paved surface, we find, or it has been found, that there were lots of fragments of lamps, of pottery lamps. And it's possible that they attest some sort of Christian gatherings, periodic perhaps, gatherings in veneration of the cave of the Annunciation. But before that, we have no evidence of early Christian gatherings apart from in the churches that were built probably in the 4th century. And so as for Jewish gatherings, well, the reference to the synagogues, the first in the Gospels, and later on in written sources, what seem to be synagogue buildings, which I've referred to earlier on, they would be the evidence for Jewish gatherings in Nazareth. But in archaeological terms, what we know of Nazareth doesn't include any evidence of Jewish gatherings at all. We've got lots of evidence for Judaism in Roman period Nazareth, but not for specifically gatherings.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.